Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today we'll be exploring pragmatism, that really interesting and distinctly American philosophical tradition. And I think especially for you, given your own philosophical background, this is going to be right up your alley.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Pragmatism really does offer, I think, a powerful alternative to those, maybe more familiar, I guess, big philosophical traditions like the analytic and the continental schools of thought.
Right. And at its heart, pragmatism really starts with this idea that understanding the world isn't just about passively observing it. It's about how we act and how we engage with it and how that shapes our knowledge.
Exactly. And what's so fascinating, I think, for a philosophical mind like yours is that pragmatism isn't just like a single unified theory of everything. It's actually a really vibrant and diverse collection of thinkers who, while they share some fundamental ideas, they often branch out in really interesting and sometimes even conflicting directions.
So for this deep dive, we'll be drawing on the really comprehensive entry on pragmatism from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, an amazing resource. And we're going to try to distill some of those key insights, especially as they relate to knowledge, truth, and this whole idea of the relationship between theory and practice.
Sounds good. Let's dive in.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning, right? Pragmatism's story really begins with this group called the Metaphysical Club. They were meeting at Harvard around 1870, and you can just imagine this really lively group fueled by some incredible thinkers, like Charles Sanders Peirce, who's often seen as the founder of pragmatism.
Yeah, and William James, of course, his close friend, who really popularized a lot of those core pragmatist ideas.
Right, and even Josiah Royce, who, he was more of an idealist. He ended up being kind of like a friendly intellectual sparring partner. And I think it's important to remember that this was happening against the backdrop of some really huge shifts in the intellectual world at the time. The rise of evolutionary theory and just the explosion of scientific inquiry.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so those early pragmatists, their focus was on some pretty big questions, like what is the nature of inquiry itself? And what does it even mean for something to be true? And James even explored the role of truth in religious belief, which is a fascinating area.
Right. And I think what's really important is that those first generation pragmatists, they set the stage. I mean, they established this unique set of problems and approaches that would really shape the whole trajectory of pragmatism. Their engagement with science, it wasn't just like, oh, we're interested in science. It was fundamental to how they thought about knowledge and truth.
Right. And for philosophers, I think that's a really key takeaway. It's this emphasis on empirical inquiry as a central part of philosophy itself. Okay, and then things take a really interesting turn with the second generation of pragmatists.
Absolutely. This is when pragmatism really starts to get its hands dirty, so to speak. I mean, it becomes much more directly engaged with those practical problems in the world, politics, education, and social reform.
Yeah, you can't talk about this period without talking about John Dewey. I mean, he's almost synonymous with pragmatism. And of course, his incredible colleague, Jane Addams, I mean, she was a pioneer in social work. She essentially invented the field.
Right.
She even won a Nobel Peace Prize for her work, which was amazing.
Wow.
And this was also the time when we see these crucial new voices coming in, like W.E.B. Du Bois and Alain Locke, who were developing really powerful philosophies of race within that pragmatist framework. It was a really important moment in American intellectual history.
Definitely. And we shouldn't forget about George Herbert Mead, who applied pragmatist ideas to the social sciences. He was really interested in how the self develops within communities. And then there's Mary Parker Follett, who offered these really insightful critiques of individualistic ontologies.
Right, and that concept of power with that she
Yeah.
developed is so relevant to how we think about organizations and collaboration today.
I think this move towards practical engagement and social critique is really what makes pragmatism so unique as a philosophical tradition. I mean, it's not just about abstract ideas. It's about making a difference in the world, about putting those ideas into action and seeing what happens. And I think for any philosopher who's thinking about the relationship between theory and practice, this emphasis on real-world consequences is something to really pay attention to. So how did pragmatism, this very American school of thought, I mean, how did it navigate the intellectual landscape of the 20th century, as new philosophical movements started to emerge?
Yeah, that's a great question. After the sort of Deweyne era and the New Deal, pragmatism's central role in philosophy did start to fade a bit, especially with the rise of analytic philosophy, which became really dominant in a lot of philosophy departments.
Yeah.
But pragmatism didn't just disappear. There were these transitional figures like C.I. Lewis, who was actually quite influential. He developed this idea of pragmatist Kantianism, where Our choices about logic, about how we categorize the world, should be informed by pragmatic considerations which systems actually work best for us.
Interesting.
Yeah, and even Quinup, while his focus was really on epistemology,
Hmm.
which is actually something that Dewey kind of warned against, um, you can still see some of those pragmatist threads running through his work.
Hmm.
But it's important to remember, and our source really emphasizes this, that pragmatism wasn't just an American phenomenon.
Right.
The early 20th century, there were these pockets of pragmatist thought all over the world, in Oxford, in France, and especially Italy. Frank Ramsey at Cambridge, he was really building on Peirce's ideas about statistical reasoning and the logic of inquiry, and his work was hugely influential.
Right. And this is where things get, I think, really fascinating when we think about philosophical connections. Wittgenstein, in his later work, he's focusing on language games and forms of life. And that really has, I think, a very pragmatist flavor to it. And he was very much influenced by Ramsey and by James's book, The Varieties of Religious Experience.
Mhm.
So even when pragmatism wasn't necessarily at the forefront, it was still there, kind of working in the background, influencing other thinkers and movements.
And then, of course, we have the resurgence of pragmatism, what we often call neo-pragmatism, starting in the 1970s. And a key figure in this revival was Richard Rorty. And he really embraced pragmatism as a way to challenge this idea, this very common assumption in mainstream epistemology, that our thoughts and our language actually represent an objective reality.
Yeah, representationalism, it's a big one to unpack.
Right. And Rorty's critique of that whole idea was really powerful and influential. And unlike, say, the classical pragmatists who often tried to build these really comprehensive philosophical systems, Rorty saw pragmatism more as a critical, even therapeutic, project. He famously said that there isn't really a deep, systematic theory of truth to be had. It doesn't capture some metaphysical connection between our beliefs and the world. For Rorty, true is simply a term we use to endorse beliefs that we find useful or that help us to achieve our goals. And so inquiry, it's not about uncovering some, pre-existing objective truth, but about finding vocabularies and practices that help us to flourish and be better humans.
Rorty's approach was definitely provocative. It shook things up, that's for sure. But it also generated a lot of debate, even within the pragmatist tradition itself. Another really important figure in this neo-pragmatist revival was Hilary Putnam. And he had a bit of a different take. He saw a lot of potential for what he called a pragmatist enlightenment, which is a really interesting idea. And he argued that there were these four key characteristics that define pragmatism. One is a rejection of philosophical skepticism.
Okay, and the second is an embrace of fallibilism. So that's the idea that our beliefs are always potentially revisable.
Right. And then we have the rejection of traditional philosophical dichotomies like fact versus value. And finally, he emphasized the primacy of practice, which is this idea that our actions and interactions with the world are really fundamental to understanding how we form our beliefs and our knowledge.
And that's such a core pragmatist idea, that connection between action and knowledge. And the story of pragmatism, of course, doesn't end there. We have Robert Brandom, who really builds on this idea of, what we do with language. So his inferentialist semantics, it emphasizes what he calls the normative pragmatics of assertion. So when you make a statement, you're not just, describing the world, you're also taking on a certain kind of commitment. You're entering into this game of giving and asking for reasons.
It's like making a move in a complex social game.
Exactly. And then, of course, we have Jürgen Habermas, who's coming from that Frankfurt School tradition. He's really engaged with pragmatism, particularly Mead's ideas about the self, in developing his theories of communicative action and discourse ethics.
Yeah, although he does have, I think, some reservations about how Peirce specifically thought about truth.
Right. But what's so fascinating, and I think this is a real takeaway for philosophers, is this constant evolution within the pragmatist tradition. So we have the neo-pragmatists like Rorty, who maybe downplayed the importance of truth, and then we have this group called the new pragmatists. And they're pushing back against that. They're trying to revitalize those classical pragmatist ideas about objectivity and a more robust conception of truth. People like Susan Hack and Cheryl Misak are really prominent voices there.
Yeah, it's a living, breathing tradition, constantly adapting and reinterpreting those core ideas in light of new challenges.
And the influence of pragmatism, it really goes far beyond those central figures and those core debates. I mean, our source points to its relevance in all sorts of areas: philosophy of race, feminist philosophy, disability studies, medical ethics, ecological thought, Native American philosophy, Latin American philosophy, even legal philosophy.
It's really impressive the range of areas where pragmatism has had an impact.
Yeah, it's a testament to just how adaptable and insightful that pragmatist perspective can be. And what's even more striking is how it's becoming increasingly global. We're seeing vibrant pragmatist communities in South America, Scandinavia, Central Europe, China. It's becoming a truly international philosophical conversation.
Okay, so we've traced the historical development, the evolution of pragmatism, which is, I mean, fascinating in itself. But now let's really dig into what pragmatism actually is. As we said, it started with those metaphysical club discussions around 1870, and Pierce and James, they were the key figures there. And both of them, they saw pragmatism as a method, a guiding principle, what Pierce called a maxim, for clarifying concepts and resolving those seemingly endless philosophical debates. And their ideas really centered around achieving a clearer understanding of truth, what it means for something to be true. And this led them to a really distinctive epistemology, an approach to how we know things, one that's very much fallibilist and anti-Cartesian, really emphasizing the practices and the norms that guide our inquiries.
It's not about starting from some absolute foundation of certainty. It's about understanding how we actually go about knowing things in the world.
Right. But even between those two foundational figures, Pierce and James, they had some pretty significant disagreements, particularly about realism. Should pragmatism be this very scientifically oriented philosophy committed to a single truth that we're all striving to uncover, which was Pierce's view? Or should it be more open to, a more pluralistic, more diverse understanding of truth, which was more in line with James and Dewey's thinking?
Yeah, and Pierce was so concerned about what he saw as these looser interpretations of his ideas that he famously renamed his own version of pragmatism.
He said he wanted a name ugly enough to be safe from kidnappers.
Exactly. But I think it's important to remember that they were both grappling with some really fundamental questions about truth and knowledge, and their debates really helped to shape the direction of pragmatism. So let's dive a little deeper into Pierce's pragmatic maxim, which is really his core contribution to pragmatism. So in his 1878 paper, How to Make Our Ideas Clear, Pierce laid out his famous maxim. And he said, consider what effects, which might conceivably have practical bearings, we conceive the object of our conception to have. Then our conception of those effects is the whole of our conception of the object. It's a mouthful, but it's a really powerful idea.
It is a bit of a mouthful.
So what's he saying? He's essentially giving us a method for understanding the meaning of our concepts, our hypotheses, by carefully considering their real-world implications. So for example, when we say something is hard, what we really mean, according to Maxim, is that it won't be scratched by a lot of other substances. So the meaning of hardness, it's tied to what happens when we interact with hard things, to the effects they have in the world.
Right, and it has a certain, I don't know, maybe almost a verificationist feel to it. The meaning of something is grounded in its observable effects.
Right. But Pierce was also very clear that these practical consequences aren't just about passively observing things. They're about what we do or what we should do. He said that, and I'm quoting here, that the entire intellectual purport of any symbol consists in the total of all general modes of rational conduct, which, conditionally, upon all the possible different circumstances and desires, would ensue upon the acceptance of the symbol.
So if I'm trying to break a window, the hardness of, a rock or a baseball bat is going to inform my decision about whether or not to use it.
Right. So it's not just about observing, it's about acting in the world, about using our knowledge to navigate our experiences and achieve our goals.
Exactly. And for Pierce, those consequences, they need to be general. They need to be intelligible. We're trying to understand the underlying laws or regularities associated with a concept like hardness, and then use that understanding to guide our actions. And it's really crucial to remember, as our source emphasizes, that the pragmatic maxim, it's not Pierce's entire theory of meaning. That comes from his much broader theory of science as semiotics. But the maxim is this really important tool for achieving conceptual clarity.
Right, and Pierce saw this as a really rigorous way to refine those traditional logical distinctions between clear and distinct ideas, and it's not just about coming up with nice-sounding definitions. It's about understanding how a concept actually functions in practice, how it shapes our actions and interactions with the world. He even used it to critique what he considered to be meaningless philosophical debates. So, for example, he argued that the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, the idea that the bread and wine literally become the body and blood of Christ, it's meaningless because it has no discernible practical consequences, no impact on how we would interact with those elements.
Yeah, if it makes no difference in how we act or experience the world, then for Peirce, it's not a meaningful concept. Okay, so now let's shift gears and look at William James's take on all of this. When he gave his famous lectures on pragmatism in 1907, he started by framing it as a way to get past what he called the present dilemma in philosophy. And this was this seemingly impossible conflict between what he called the tough-minded empiricists, those who are really focused on facts, on what we can observe,
Right.
and then the tender-minded rationalists who put their faith in a priori principles, those abstract philosophical systems.
Okay, so you've got, your hardcore empiricists on one side and your idealistic rationalists on the other.
Exactly. And James was living in a time when, science was really ascendant, but religious belief was still this incredibly powerful force. And so he saw pragmatism as this potential bridge between those two ways of thinking. So his pragmatic method, it was a way to make sense of fundamental concepts like truth, free will, even religious beliefs. And he argued that if we just carefully consider the practical differences that would result from one side of a debate being true versus the other, a lot of these seemingly intractable metaphysical debates they'd just disappear. They'd become irrelevant.
Well, I love that.
And his famous example is this squirrel example. So imagine a man walking around a tree, and there's a squirrel on that tree, and it's always moving, staying on the opposite side of the tree from the man. So the question is the man also walking on the squirrel? And it seems like this endless debate, with no clear resolution.
It sounds like one of those late-night dorm room philosophical conversations.
Exactly. But James says, look, let's clarify what we practically mean by going around. If by going around we mean being successively to the north, east, south, and west of the squirrel, then yes, the man is going around it. But if we mean being successively in front of, to the right of, behind, and to the left of the squirrel, then no, he isn't. So by carefully unpacking those practical implications of the term, the debate just vanishes.
And it's such a simple example, but it's so illustrative of how pragmatism can cut through all that philosophical jargon and get to the heart of the matter.
Right. And James himself was, he was very clear that he was explaining this method more through examples than through this rigorous systematic analysis. He didn't offer, a set of strict criteria for what counts as a practical consequence. And he said that he wasn't really inventing anything new. He was just making explicit this common sense empiricist attitude that prioritizes how useful our theories and concepts are over whether or not they're, accurate representations of reality.
Yeah, it's about what works, about what helps us to navigate the world effectively.
Exactly. And this difference in emphasis, Peirce's focus on this rigorous logical maxim and James's more flexible, more example-driven method, I think that really sets the stage for their really quite different views on truth itself.
Yeah, that's a big one. So how did they each approach the question of what it means for something to be true?
Well, Peirce, he saw his account of truth as being absolutely essential to understanding reality itself, which he believed was crucial for any good scientific methodology. James, on the other hand, he used his pragmatic approach to advocate for this more nuanced and in some ways more pluralistic understanding of truth.
Okay, so let's start with Peirce's perspective. How did he link truth to this idea of reality?
Well, he addressed that really directly in the conclusion of his paper, How to Make Our Ideas Clear. And he says that, we all have this intuitive sense of what we mean by reality, but to get a really clear philosophical conception of it, we need to use the pragmatic maxim. And this is where his concept of truth comes in. He said, and I'm quoting here, "The opinion which is fated to be ultimately agreed to by all who investigate is what we mean by the truth, and the object represented in this opinion is the real." So for Peirce, truth is what we would all eventually agree on if we were to inquire long enough, and that agreement, that convergence of belief, is what reveals reality to us.
Okay, so it's not just about like individual opinions or beliefs. It's about this ideal of a community of inquirers all striving towards a shared understanding.
Exactly. And this is what he called the realist conception of reality, which he explicitly contrasted with the nominalist conception that was really common in a lot of earlier philosophy. And nominalism tends to see reality as just the cause of our individual experiences, but we can't really know anything about it beyond that. And so Peirce's view, it shifts the focus away from that noble cause and towards the consequent convergence of belief that happens through this process of inquiry.
It's a really interesting move. It's like saying that reality reveals itself through this ongoing process of communal investigation.
Exactly. And that leads him to this famous slogan, "Truth is the end of inquiry." But it's important to understand that by end, he doesn't necessarily mean like a finish line, a point when inquiry stops. He means it more like the goal, the telos, the thing that inquiry is always striving towards.
Right. It's like the North Star guiding our intellectual explorations.
Exactly. But of course, that idea has faced some criticisms. Bertrand Russell, for instance, he questioned whether this whole convergence of inquiry idea, was it just, wishful thinking on Peirce's part? And Quine, he was skeptical that all inquiries would really converge on a single, perfect system of beliefs.
Those are some pretty big names, raising some pretty serious doubts.
Yeah, and Peirce himself, he later kind of softened his stance a bit, saying that ultimate convergence might be more of a regulative hope that guides us. And he even admitted that it's not like a guaranteed truth, that there's this one belief that everyone would inevitably reach. It's just what he chooses to define as truth.
Interesting. So it's almost like a working definition, a way to orient our intellectual efforts.
Right. And then there's this other line of criticism, which says that Peirce's view of truth isn't really realist enough. It seems to define truth in terms of our beliefs and inquiry rather than in terms of, this mind-independent world out there. Like, what about truths that nobody ever investigates? What about those lost facts, as some philosophers call them? And Peirce's response to that is really grounded in fallibilism, that idea that we can always be wrong, that our beliefs are always open to revision. And so for him, objectivity comes not from some direct access to the world, but from the potential infinity of the community of inquiry.
So it's like this ever-expanding process of checking and rechecking our beliefs against the world and against each other.
It's a really fascinating attempt to combine both realist and idealist insights. Okay, so now let's turn to James's view of truth, which is, it's definitely the one that sparks the most debate. He famously said that the true is the name of whatever proves itself to be good in the way of belief, and good, too, for definite, assignable reasons. And then he had this other really famous line: the true, to put it very briefly, is only the expedient in the way of our thinking, just as the right is only the expedient in the way of our behaving. And the word expedient, it can be a little misleading because he immediately qualifies it by saying that expedient should be understood in this very broad sense, in the long run, taking into account all of our experiences and needs.
So it's not just about what's like immediately useful or convenient.
Right. He elaborated on this further, saying that ideas become true just insofar as they help us to get into satisfactory relation with other parts of our experience.
Yeah.
He talked about beliefs being true instrumentally, meaning that a belief is true if it helps us to navigate our experience, to connect things in a way that works, that's useful, that saves us effort. And he went even further, saying that this goodness of belief could include things like religious comfort, social cohesion, even happiness.
Okay, so this is where we start to get into some of those classic objections to James's view.
Yeah, the most famous one being Russell's, what about believing in Santa Claus? If that makes a child happy, does that make it true? And our source points out that that's kind of an unfair oversimplification of James's position. James would probably say that, yeah, the happiness from that belief, it makes it good, but not necessarily true in this whole sense. The belief needs to fit with, all the other parts of our experience, and it needs to hold up in the long run.
It's got to be more than just a temporary feel-good belief.
Right, exactly. Okay, so moving on from theories of truth, let's talk about pragmatist epistemology. So this is how they approach the question of knowledge, how we acquire it, how we justify our beliefs. And the pragmatists generally saw their approach as a return to common sense and experience. They were rejecting what they saw as these really problematic ideas inherited from, those earlier traditions, ideas like Cartesian foundationalism and nominalism, and those various versions of the copy theory of truth. They saw all of these as kind of interconnected and ultimately leading to dead ends.
Yeah, so they were trying to break free from this philosophical baggage that they felt was holding back real inquiry.
Exactly. And a really important starting point for pragmatist epistemology is their critique of traditional philosophical skepticism. And this really begins with Peirce's early paper, Some Consequences of Four Incapacities. He was taking aim at Cartesianism and that whole emphasis on universal doubt, that idea that we should doubt everything we believe in order to find a solid foundation for knowledge. Peirce argued that this was just not coherent and not practical. He said we always operate within a framework of certainties that we don't even question. We can't doubt everything at once.
Right. It's like trying to rebuild a house from the ground up while you're still living in it.
Exactly. And he also rejected this Cartesian idea of knowledge as this single chain of deductive reasoning.
Yeah.
Instead, he proposed this idea of a cable of interconnected arguments, where the strength comes from the multiple independent lines of reasoning that all point towards the same conclusion.
So it's a much more robust and flexible way of thinking about how we know things.
Right. And for pragmatists, universal doubt, it's not just impractical, it's unnecessary. Inquiry always happens within a specific context, with all sorts of background beliefs and assumptions. And so the focus shouldn't be on achieving absolute certainty, but on developing these methods of inquiry that are self-correcting, that allow us to make progress, even though we know we can always be wrong. And Pierce had this great line where he said, directly challenging Descartes, do not pretend to doubt in philosophy what you do not doubt in your hearts.
I love that. It's a call to be honest with ourselves about what we really believe and to start our inquiries from there.
Exactly. And James, in his essay, The Will to Believe, he made a similar point. He said that we have these two desires, the desire for truth and the desire to avoid error. And that Cartesian method, it prioritizes avoiding error above all else, even if it means missing out on potential truths. And Dewey, in his book, The Quest for Certainty, he argued that this obsession with eliminating all uncertainty, it actually cuts us off from this vital connection between our theories and our practical engagement with the world.
So for pragmatists, it's okay to be uncertain, to be wrong sometimes. It's part of the process of learning and growing.
Exactly. So if it's not about achieving some kind of absolute knowledge, then what is the focus of pragmatist epistemology? And for them, the emphasis shifts to this idea of inquiry itself, this ongoing process of trying to gain knowledge, to refine our understanding of the world. And they're really interested in figuring out what makes someone a good inquirer. What habits, what virtues do they need to cultivate? And Pierce's early essay, The Fixation of Belief, is a really important text here. He argued that what drives inquiry is doubt, this uncomfortable feeling of not knowing, and that the goal of inquiry is to reach a state of settled belief. And then he compared his method of science to these other ways of fixing belief. The method of tenacity, which is just clinging to your beliefs no matter what. The method of authority, which is accepting beliefs based on, what someone in power tells you. And the a priori method, which relies on supposedly self-evident principles. And he argued that only the method of science is self-correcting, that it's the only one that's truly concerned with getting things right.
Yeah, it's about being open to revising our beliefs when the evidence demands it.
Exactly. And Dewey, he had an even more radical conception of inquiry. He laid this out in his big work, Logic, the Theory of Inquiry. And he said that inquiry starts not just with doubt, but with a problem, an indeterminate situation that we're trying to resolve. And he said that there's this objective indeterminacy to the situation itself. It's not just that we don't know what's going on, it's that the situation itself is, in a way, unsettled.
And this is a really subtle but important point. It's not just about our subjective lack of knowledge. It's about something real in the world that needs to be addressed.
Right. And Dewey really emphasized that this pattern of inquiry, of moving from a problem to a solution, something we see all over the place, from our everyday lives to the most sophisticated science. And this was a way for him to show the deep continuity between theoretical inquiry and practical action, to challenge that traditional separation between them that's been so dominant in Western thought.
So for Dewey, inquiry isn't just this abstract intellectual exercise. It's a way of being in the world, of interacting with it and trying to make sense of it.
Now, pragmatism is often linked to empiricism, and there are definitely historical connections there. But their view of experience is really different from those more mainstream empiricist views. Think about Locke or Hume or even Carnap, the logical positivist. They often saw experience as like the given, this raw stream of sense data that we just passively receive.
Yeah, it's like we're just these empty vessels being filled up with sensations.
But the pragmatists, James, Pierce, and Dewey, they all rejected that. They argued that experience is much richer, much more integrated. It's shaped by our interactions with the world and by the concepts and ideas that we bring to those interactions.
So it's not a passive process, it's an active one. We're not just mirrors reflecting the world, we're shaping it and being shaped by it at the same time.
Exactly. And James's idea of radical empiricism is really key to understanding this. He said that the relations between things, those connections, they're just as much a part of our experience as the things themselves. And so experience for him, it's this interconnected web. It doesn't need some, outside force to hold it together. And Pierce, he also really emphasized this continuity of experience, this idea that we can directly perceive connections and relations in the world, not just isolated sensations.
Right, and that challenges this traditional empiricist view that all we really perceive are just these simple atomic units of experience.
And Pierce had this really complex theory of perception, where he distinguished between the raw sensory input, the percept, and the perceptual judgment, which is how we interpret and make sense of that input. And he really emphasized that perception is fallible, that we can misinterpret what we see. And Dewey, in his account of experience, he stressed that it's a dynamic process of interacting with our environment to meet our needs.
Yeah.
And so what we actually experience, that nature that we encounter, it's not totally separate from our concepts and our actions. It's interesting that, later neo-pragmatists like Rorty and Brandom, they kind of downplay the importance of experience, which is something that a lot of those new pragmatists have criticized. They argue that a robust understanding of experience is really essential to pragmatism.
Yeah, it's about taking experience seriously, not just dismissing it as like some kind of raw material for our theories.
Okay, so that brings us to the pragmatist view of representations, how our thoughts and beliefs relate to the world. And they rejected this Cartesian dualist idea that, the content of our thoughts is somehow trapped inside our minds. They argued that the meaning of our thoughts is defined by their role in our actions, how we use them, what consequences they lead to.
It's like, a hammer. The meaning of a hammer isn't just like its shape or its material. It's about what you can do with it, how you can use it to build something.
Exactly. And all the classical pragmatists, they really emphasize this idea that beliefs are not just static pictures in our minds. They're habits of action. They guide our desires and our behavior in the world. And this connects really well with contemporary work in embodied cognition. The idea that our minds are not separate from our bodies, that our thinking is shaped by our physical interactions with the environment.
And then we have Peirce's semiotics, his theory of signs. I mean, this is a really major contribution to philosophy, and it's still hugely influential today.
Yeah, he had this really comprehensive system for understanding how signs work. And for him, the most basic sign relation wasn't just between a sign and what it refers to. It was a three-way relationship.